Welcome to the podcast of Voices of Peace, which is a part of Traces and Dreams podcast, and we are very happy to have here Professor Volodymyr Dubovyk. The topic for today is peace deals and dangerous illusions. What kind of end to the war is possible? So we are going to talk about international relations, Russian invasion of Ukraine, and other aspects of this topic. Before we start the conversation, could you maybe please introduce yourself?
Yes, well, first of all, thank you for having me for this conversation. It's a great pleasure for me to be taking part. I'm Volodymyr Dubovyk, and I'm Associate Professor of International Relations and also Director of the Center for International Studies at Odesa Mechnikov National University in Odesa, Ukraine. And I'm also a Senior Fellow of the Center for European Policy Analysis, which is a research organization in Washington, D.C.
Thank you. As you say, you're an expert in international relations, and my first question would be, you are also a co-author of the book, which was published in 1999, Ukraine and European Security. And the question is, what are the changes in the field of international relations? Have you seen the major shift from that, like comparing that time and now?
Oh, there have been a bunch of shifts, obviously. First of all, we had a major event which relates to the United States, but actually for the entire world. That's 9/11 attacks against the United States, which really changed in many ways how U.S. viewed the world and started basically eventually two wars that Americans launched, two military operations in the Middle East, Greater Middle East, Afghanistan and Iraq. Second thing is that Russia back in 1999 was not necessarily a benign entity, but it wasn't as belligerent and aggressive as it is now. And of course, it was just changing its leader from Boris Yeltsin to Putin, who eventually created a different kind of Russia in many ways. And of course, he advocated this more aggressive, assertive kind of, and eventually belligerent and militaristic approach to international affairs, specifically to the neighbors, and most of all, in particular, to Ukraine. Then other changes were, of course, that the NATO and the EU expanded, and we might go back to this issue if you'd like eventually in our conversation, because some people see that's the reason why Russia is so reacting in such a way right now, and I would advocate that it's not, because when the EU and NATO expanded and enlarged, some countries joined, there was no apparent anti-NATO reason or the rationale behind it. Hidden rationale was that if Russia becomes what it is today, then it would be helpful to be members of NATO and be protected by collective security and collective defense clause. But no one said that we are going to fight against Russia or undermine Russia or anything like that. Basically, instead, what Russia is doing today, it's undermining itself, spending all these resources, human and material, in launching and continuing and waging that war against Ukraine for 3 years now. That's only the massive part of it, because, of course, the war started back in 2014. Yeah, and so therefore there are many changes in the region, that the countries of Central Eastern Europe and Southeastern Europe, joined both EU and NATO, and that really changed the world. Since 1999, China has become the People's Republic of China has become a much more assertive player and stronger player, frankly, in the sense of their diplomacy, their economic power, their military might as well. That has changed. And U.S. continues to be a superpower like it was in 1999, but at the same time, they spent a lot of resource and reputation, frankly, in these two endless wars in Afghanistan and Iraq. But at the same time, that actually shaping to a large extent the thinking of many Americans. Some Americans, they don't want to be involved in another major war. And that's one of the reasons that they support Mr. Trump when he says that U.S. shouldn't be resolving all the conflicts around the world, and of course shouldn't be on the edge of being involved in direct confrontation, for instance, with Russian Federation. That's understandable. The previous administration, Biden administration, also didn't want to do that. But that's I'm just reminding about this argument that in the light in the context of those two long wars that Americans got really tired of. So right now, if you like, there is more of an isolationist wave in US when they think, okay, enough is enough. We've been involved at the high cost and losing our guys overseas for a long time. So maybe it's now time for us to actually come home. So that's why this America First slogan by President Trump actually received some sympathetic response from American public.
Thank you. And when we talk about the Ukrainian perspective, how did we end up here where we are now? If you are to name the reasons why Russia invaded Ukraine, what would they be?
Well, there are many. Well, first of all, it's always been a combination, and we've been guessing about this in the first weeks and months of the invasion. Most of the roundtables and panels were focused, among other things, on this, trying to understand what's going on and what really motivated Putin, to go across the line and tipped him in this direction. So one reason, of course, is that Ukraine was growing, to become a more assertive player itself, and having some agency and becoming more able, to make decisions for itself. And that really unnerved and worried Russia, because they wanted to have Ukraine by any means always within their sphere of control. Well, now that has even changed to the extent that they want some of Ukrainian lands within the Russian Federation. But in general terms, they I don't think ever wanted to incorporate the entire Ukraine into Russian Federation, but they clearly wanted for Ukraine not to go anywhere, gold quotation marks, not to leave Russian sphere of control, Russian sphere of influence, and definitely not to be part of like EU and NATO and be friendly to the West. That would be a major problem for Russia. Historically, even, Russia became known as a Russian Empire exactly at the time when they incorporated half of Ukraine, the eastern part of Ukraine, into their state. In the second half of 17th century, that far. Because before that, there was the Moscow state. There was a Tsar in charge. And since then, Peter the Great, whom Putin tries to emulate in so many respects, Peter the First, Peter the Great, he actually became the Russian emperor. So the name came about and empire came about. So what Russia is doing, I think they're recreating this empire. So it's new imperialistic view of Ukraine. I would like to stress that and underline that and stress this out, emphasize it, that Russia is an empire and always was. It maybe was in a different way comparing to, say, traditional empires like Britain or France, who would send their troops overseas to like Africa and Asia and seize some colonies there. But Russia was expanding all the time at the expense of many other territories around it. And of course, the Russian Empire crashed after the First World War, and some countries became independent, like Finland and Poland, but they always were worried about Russia. So anyway, so this neo-imperialistic thinking, it was very important. Once now late American scholar and politician Zbigniew Brzezinski, of Polish origin, he was a national security advisor to President Carter. He said that without Ukraine under Russian control, Russia has a chance to become a normal, democratic, kind of civilized country. But with Ukraine subdued to Russia and under Russian control, Russia automatically becomes an empire, and that stands valid up to the present day. So Putin saw that Ukraine is drifting slowly towards the West, and he didn't like it. He also saw that maybe Ukraine is becoming stronger militarily, so he didn't want to wait for another 5 to 10 years, maybe. We saw that for Russia, and we're still seeing that for Russia to wage the war against Ukraine, it's a really hard task for them. And so he decided to start early instead. And then, of course, he wanted to deliver, some kind of a message to the West. That's ours. Don't mess with us. So he's really fighting West in many ways in Ukraine, not just Ukraine. But ultimately, it is about the future of Ukraine and the future of Russia. And it's a mixture of ideological cliches, like the Putin has been saying for a long time now, that he doesn't think that Ukraine exists, that there is such thing as Ukraine. That's really a denial of the very existence of a large nation of many tens of millions of people. And he says, but that there's no such thing as Ukraine. It's an artificial state. he keeps saying, let's divide it. We'll grab something, and you, for instance, Poles or Romanians or Hungarians or whoever might actually grab your own part of Ukraine. So that's very much, the 19th century kind of thinking. The West was not ready for that kind of thinking. Like, what are you talking about? There is a sovereign country up there. The borders are actually internationally recognized. Territorial integrity is a sacred principle there and value. And Russia signed many, many agreements with Ukraine, of course, where they recognize Ukraine's borders. But he has a different thinking, like if you don't like ideologically, conceptually what I'm doing, if you call it 19th century policy, I don't care. I'm still doing what I have, what I think that needs to be done. And generally, we're dealing with a person who said that disintegration and breakup of Soviet Union was the biggest tragedy, his personal tragedy of his life. So I'm not saying he wants to restore, or probably he wouldn't be able to restore the entire Soviet Union now to the scale of how Soviet Union looked like before 1991. But he's trying. He's trying to grab pieces, and Ukraine in that respect was always very key to his plans.
Thank you. I listened to one of your podcasts where you said that you are an Americanist, and I'd like to ask you more about Ukraine-US relations. How should we interpret what is going regarding the relationship of Ukraine specifically with the US, and in what direction should it move?
Well, it's a difficult moment for U.S.-Ukraine relations. We always had a very rich relations ever since Ukraine became independent in 1991. But of course, we don't have time now for me to launch an entire lecture reminding of different things that happened since 91 between U.S. and Ukraine. I would say about the previous administration, the Joe Biden administration, that they've decided for a good reason that Ukraine should be supported against Russian aggression, and they actually put together a coalition of countries in support of Ukraine, and they were very much involved with financial assistance and weapons supply and everything, and their assistance and assistance of other countries. By the way, where we have some leaders who are even more supportive of Ukraine than others, very much appreciated. Among those leaders throughout this last 3 years of large-scale invasion of Russia against Ukraine, you can definitely name, for instance, Baltic countries, Poland, and Nordic countries, including Sweden, by the way, who's been very persistent in supporting Ukraine, and under various governments, by the way. So in some countries, you basically have a consensus. There is a cohesion on the level of political elites and on the level of public opinion, really, that Ukraine should be supported, that this kind of Russia's aggression couldn't stand. It's really a threat. It's really a problem for entire Europe. It's not just a problem for Ukraine itself. And no doubt, no surprise there that Sweden, with Finland, wanted to join NATO and being able to join NATO in the light of a massive Russian aggression. So that really reflects thinking in Europe. And that's to the credit, I think, of President Biden, who actually worked diligently and quickly in helping both countries, Finland and Sweden, to join NATO. And, and we're talking, by the way, here, you ask about US, but maybe just a couple of sentences. We're talking about two countries that have been very serious about their defense, by the way, for decades, and having very robust and well-trained and well-prepared military forces, and invested enough in their defense and producing a lot of very good weapons. That actually many other European countries, including Ukraine, now hoping to get to. But still, they wanted to join NATO because they were so appalled and actually worried about the Russian aggression against Ukraine. But going back to US, so Biden decided to support Ukraine, but at the same time, he was never really resolute in terms of what he wants this war to end. How he sees the end of the war. He didn't want to complete defeat of Russia, clearly to the extent that Russia will be humiliated and disintegrated. He didn't want Ukraine to lose, but he not necessarily wanted Ukraine to have this absolute clear victory. So therefore, the money and the weapons were given to the extent that Ukraine would lose the war badly. And that really eventually infuriated Ukrainians. There have been huge delays about weapons supply. There have been many fears in Washington about, okay, if we give this weapon, maybe Russia would escalate, so the fears of escalation. Then some weapons were given, but there were restrictions in how Ukraine can use it. So eventually that led to some kind of frustration within Ukraine, really. And many people in Ukraine, surprisingly, especially in the context of what's happening right now, they were not necessarily afraid of Biden leaving and maybe Trump coming back. But now we see that there were reasons to be afraid, and I was among those Ukrainian experts who said that no, we shouldn't expect anything good coming out of Trump coming back to the White House for Ukraine. I mean, because that's a person who never really liked Ukrainians too much. He never understood significance of Ukraine, the geostrategic significance of Ukraine being in the middle of Europe there, this very interesting geopolitical situation. He never understood why Ukraine should be supported against Russia. He'd been very sympathetic to Russia all along. He's never uttered a single negative word about President Putin. He actually tends to defend him all the time. Every time someone is talking to him, a journalist, and they ask him, about Putin, he defends him all the time. So he's been trying to have this grand bargain with Russia, with Putin for a long time. He wanted in the previous 4 years of his presidency. He couldn't for various reasons, but now he's going back to that idea. And of course, it's very hurtful to Ukraine because this is happening in the middle of this major invasion that Russia is continuing to wage on Ukraine. So President Trump, I'm afraid to say that he really sides with Russia now. He really doesn't believe any arguments that Ukraine is trying to put forward. He goes as far as everybody probably knows, that he's kind of blaming Ukraine for the war, that he sees the President Zelensky, he says, as an obstacle towards peace, which is not true, because even the recent conversation in the White House, this kind of scandalous, intense conversation that they had when Zelensky was visiting, Zelensky, the only thing Zelensky was trying to talk about is how Ukraine sees its interests, and trying to tell his American counterparts how our vision. But then he was brutally interrupted and humiliated, and so that was a problem, of course. And now there is tension, where you see basically Trump siding with Russia, because we don't hear of any compromise or any concessions on the part of Russia. So when they said they're going to be a balanced and fair and equidistant approach by this administration to both Russia and Ukraine, we're not seeing it, because there's no pressure on Russia whatsoever. Russia is basically applauding what Trump is doing and rejoicing. On the other hand, Ukraine is being squeezed all the time. One day suspension of military aid, another day suspension of sharing military intelligence, another day it's the end of a project that Americans had to support our energy infrastructure, Ukraine's energy infrastructure, which has been hit by Russian drones and missiles all the time. So there's always some messages like, we're not with you, or even the votes in the United Nations recently. It was unthinkable even some time ago that US would insist on a resolution where basically Ukraine and Russia are kind of blamed in the same way for the war, and then no one mentions who is an aggressor, who is a victim, and who is defending itself. So that's unfortunate. And also in terms of ideology of international relations, I think Trump is very similar to Putin. He's also an imperialistic politician, despite him saying that US should come back home and not to be involved in many conflicts around the world. At the same time, look at his rhetorics towards Canada, Panama, Greenland, and Denmark, and other places, and Mexico. It really reminds Putin, because Putin also thinks the same way, and also there is a lot of political realism there. One of the concepts which basically determines that if you're a smaller country next to the great power, you're doomed. You have to be within the sphere of control of that great power. That's what Putin thinks about Ukraine in particular, and that's what seems to be Trump is now saying about Canada and Mexico and Greenland and everything. So unfortunately, we have some strange kind of affinity towards Russia, and he wants to have a quick deal. Not really being interested in longer-term consequences. The ceasefire he wants, not thinking about the mechanism, how you support it, what's the mechanism of peacekeeping, what about Ukraine's security guarantees, what if Putin breaks that ceasefire down the line, which is quite probable. That's what Ukrainians have been afraid of, that Putin would just use his pause, he would mobilize more people, he would produce more weapons, and he would continue to crash Ukraine, because he said, there's no such thing as Ukraine. There's no such thing as Ukrainian language. If you're saying that, you're kind of saying that, well, we'll probably just try and finish the job. So there is a major difference now, unfortunately, in strategic terms about this between Kiev and Washington, between Zelensky and Trump. And I should say not just Zelensky, because basically there is a consensus within Ukrainian society that Americans are now backstabbing Ukraine and in a way betraying Ukraine, and basically Ukrainians want to see how this peace, when it comes, how it will be supported, and Trump doesn't want to hear anything about it.
Thank you. Now, when you also mentioned the ceasefire, I think we can move to peace talks and talk about the illusions.
Yeah. I mean, the ceasefire, of course, is something that we want. I would like to articulate this again and emphasize again and again, because, of course, there is a lot of misunderstanding and also deliberate propaganda, misinformation that Ukraine doesn't want the war to stop. That Zelensky personally maybe doesn't like the war to stop, but none of that is true. No one wants this war to stop more than Ukrainians. There are millions of people, tens of millions of people whose life is disrupted. All of the Ukrainians' lives are disrupted on February 24th, 2022, when Russia launched this massive, large-scale invasion. In some way, we're basically dealing with a nation of Ukrainians who are, on one hand, we are resolute and we are resilient and we are trying to fight back in any way everyone can. Some at the front line, some, beyond the front line or behind the front line, rather on the Ukrainian side. But on the other hand, people are, of course, exhausted and tired, and people want their normal lives back. And people want their jobs and come to their homes if they had to leave it. And just the normal sky above them, where you don't need to listen to the sounds and try to distinguish, is it a drone? What kind of drone is it? Is it just a reconnaissance drone? Then it's no big deal. We just ignore it. Or is it some kind of a drone, the kamikaze drone that would actually smash into you the next moment? Or the same thing with missiles that fly so fast, then by the time you have a air raid alert signal, then missile already hits because they fly so fast, and we can't down many of those missiles, and we will be not able to down more and more of those missiles because American assistance, military aid is suspended now, and we're going to be running short or out of the weapons that we need for our defense system. So Ukraine really, really, really badly needs that peace, and of course, I'm not even mentioning the economy, which has been ruined in many ways and destroyed. But what does it mean for us? Do we want any kind of peace? Do we need a peace in quotation marks? Do we need a peace that would not be peace at all? We're looking for the peace which is going to be fair, okay? Because there is an aggressor, they attacked us, they committed massive war crimes, they destroyed our economy, occupied our lands. Millions of Ukrainians are now living under conditions of being under control of occupier. So there is no fairness now in giving up on Ukraine and actually delivering everything that Russia wants to Moscow. Second thing, viable peace. I mean, and I alluded to that before. We need a peace that would be working, because we had experience with this particular country and this particular threat. Back in 1994, Ukraine denuclearized. We had nuclear weapons in our territory. We said, okay, we're giving them up. And guess where did they go to? They went to Russia. There was a Budapest memorandum in 94, which was signed, and countries like US, UK, and Russia, offered assurances of Ukraine's security. So that's broken. Since 2014, there have been several, temporary peace deals called Minsk deals, about the end of the war, but they're all broken. All the ceasefires that Ukraine ever had since 2014, since their aggression against Ukraine started, they were broken. So therefore, right now, we're seeing even more maximalistic Putin. He is really pushing. He really wants to destroy Ukraine. Okay, if he can't get the entire Ukraine under his control, he'll make sure that he destroys it. So it would take tens of years and generations of Ukrainians to restore it even. So Ukraine is weakened, obviously, by these attacks. So we want to stop the war. But again, it's going to be a viable end of the war, or not. Who's going to be supporting this? Ukraine wants some security guarantees. And that's not just the word. That's something that we need badly. And, if we can be part of NATO, that's probably great, even though some people now question even the NATO's ability maybe to defend its members. But apparently we're not going to be becoming part of NATO anytime soon. despite our willingness to do so. Okay, then if we can have some other mechanisms like of security guarantees. Well, first of all, financial assistance and military supply from other countries to Ukraine. That's great. That's second best maybe after NATO membership. And many countries willing support to Ukraine, including Sweden, by the way. And it's already more and more often mentioned concept of coalition of willing, the countries that continue to support and willing to continue to support Ukraine down the road. And that's great, but what Russia is saying that the condition on their part to end the war and sign some kind of ceasefire is that this assistance stops. So what Russia is insisting that Ukraine remains completely vulnerable at their mercy, and they can actually reactivate their aggression any moment from that point on. If Ukraine demilitarizes how they insist, if Ukraine, if Ukraine's doesn't get any fresh supply of weapons from some countries, then eventually, of course, Russia, which is producing a lot of those weapons, will have an upper hand. So that's a problem for us going forward. And that's why there is a lot of resistance within Ukrainian society. Despite us wanting peace badly, we don't want the peace in name only. We don't want the peace at any at any expense. We don't want the peace that would basically not only reward the aggressor and undermine Ukraine's position, but would actually encourage aggressor and embolden aggressor for more acts of aggression down the road.
I guess this is the elephant in the room that Russia has all these agreements, starting with the Budapest Memorandum.
Absolutely.
And I wanted to ask you, what are the other blind spots or maybe other elephants in the room, which maybe uncomfortable questions Western leaders or even Ukrainian society itself are avoiding in the peace talks?
Well, I mean, there are many other elements, but this is the main one. If we're going to sign something, what would that mean? What are we signing? All right. So, what are we getting ourselves in? The ceasefire in itself, not bad. I mean, obviously on the surface, right? People stop dying, okay, on the front line, and also there will be no missile and drone strikes at Ukrainian cities, including my hometown of Odessa, where we actually had some pretty heavy, severe attacks in a row for several nights now. And that's a problem, obviously, for us. So we want to have just a normal sleep like everyone else on the planet Earth has. We have the same desire and same basic needs like everyone else, any other people around the world. So, but we want to know, like, what would happen if we sign up, for instance, temporarily, because Ukraine would never agree to recognizing that Russian occupied territories of land of Ukraine, which is now under Russian control, would become part of Russian Federation. But if we're signing away as a part of that deal some of our territory, like, okay, what are we getting in return? And so far, it doesn't seem that there is any clarity on that question. And moreover, on the contrary, it seems that Russia is going to be getting more and more, in addition to getting this lands that they occupy within Ukraine. They would probably get, like I said already, they would probably get maybe demilitarization of Ukraine. Ukraine is not joining NATO. And actually demands on Russia's part, they would only increase. That's how they work. If they see the weakness in opponent or the counterpart, like US now, they would demand more and more and more. And therefore, a lot of countries in Europe are up in the arms, quotation marks, against any kind of premature deal with Russia, because they think they can be next. And that easily can be true. I might remind people that when Russia attacked Georgia in 2008, before that, a lot of people said, no, well, they wouldn't do it, but they did it. And they stopped like kilometers away from the capital of Tbilisi. And then people said, well, but that's Georgia, a small country, so they would never dare to do it to Ukraine. But they did in 2014, and they took away Crimea, and occupied it. And they also sent troops and messed with Donbass, eastern region of Ukraine, ever since. And then again, people said, well, but that's, small incursions. So still the big war of Russia against Ukraine is unthinkable. But then February 24th, 22 happened. And then ever since we have this massive invasion of Ukraine by Russia. And then, therefore, when some people say that the rest of Europe is safe, in these circumstances? What proof do you have? Everything's possible now. Everything is up in the air. No rules, nothing. There is no international order. You can't restrain Russia by just norms of international law. They are violating it. I mean, I'm not even I mentioned briefly that they're committing massive war crimes, that they kidnap children en masse from Ukraine, and doing all this terrible stuff. But now, of course, we are in this situation where we would like to have more fairness, because initially Ukraine and over the 3 years we wanted also to have maybe the tribunals, maybe there are some sort of decisions that Russia should respond in legal terms and be responsible, for the crimes they committed. We wanted to have reparations. We wanted to have reparations because Russia destroyed a big portion of our economy. So give us the money then. So therefore, there is some fairness now in this idea, which is now discussed in Europe, especially in the light of Americans turning their back on Ukraine, unfortunately, that the frozen Russian assets should be actually be unfrozen in the sense that they will be used to help Ukraine and give money to Ukraine, or maybe buy stuff for Ukraine, not necessarily give it directly to Ukraine. And by the way, here, since I mentioned give it to Ukraine, there's a lot of cliches that especially among some pro-Trump people in US, but also in other parts of the world, that Zelensky somehow is benefiting financially, personally. Even the national security advisor to Trump, Mr. Waltz, recently alluded that there may be some kind of personal interest for Zelensky in continuing the war. Nothing can be further away from truth. He would be happily in situation if the war ends. Moreover, by the way, this attacks by America on Zelensky personally only contribute to his rating growing in Ukraine. So if we have elections anytime soon, he would probably win quite easily. Despite what was going on several months ago, his rating was not that convincing, still the highest, but not convincing. But now his rating will grow, because people are seeing that Ukraine is insulted, not just Zelensky, but Ukraine is insulted and betrayed, and therefore they kind of coalescing and consolidating around their leader, even those Ukrainians who had some questions for Zelensky, but they're still rallying around the flag, so to speak. And if they want to remove him. There have been some rumors that Americans are even meeting now with members of Ukrainian opposition. Well, good luck with that, because of course their ratings are very low, and many people wanted to remove Zelensky, and Russia sent hundreds of thousands of people with arms to actually remove Zelensky. So unfortunately, US is now trying to do what Putin wanted to do all along: remove this government of Ukraine out of power. But that's not going to happen, because Ukrainians decide who is running their country. We didn't have a say in who should be the president of Ukraine. All right, but they shouldn't have a say in terms of who should be of US, of course, and who should be president of Ukraine. And moreover, let me remind you that in 2019, when President Zelensky became president, he was running on this anti-war, stop the war platform. It was President Poroshenko before him who actually was seen as more hawkish and more militaristic, and Zelensky accused him of continuing that war, and he said, we just need to stop shooting, and I'll just sit down with Putin, and we would find a way to end this war. But ever since he understood that this is not possible, all right, this is not possible with Putin, because it's really running contrary to what he wants to do with Ukraine. And eventually, the no deal was in place. And eventually, of course, Russia decided, okay, with this president, we can't have any business. So we would have to launch this massive invasion in 2022. So people need to remember that across the world, that Zelensky was actually elected by Ukrainian people in a landslide back in 2019. And among the major reasons of such a successful result in elections back then for Zelensky was that he said, I want to end this war. And he sounded like a pro-Russian candidate in many ways. But the actual situation, led him to understand that Russia doesn't want anything. They don't want peace. They don't want anything to do with Ukraine. They just want to destroy Ukraine. And that's, of course, a huge problem.
I very much agree with you about the fact that Ukrainians want peace more than everything else, but we want, of course, it fair, and it's for me, myself, very difficult. I'm also from Ukraine. And today in the morning, we only had 3-hour missile attack on my region where my family is located. So it's very
Where is that?
It's Chernivtsi.
Okay. Bukovina, sure.
Thankfully, it's quite far away, but it still doesn't.
Sure, doesn't matter. Yeah.
Of course, it's very devastating.
Of course.
And I would like to ask you, so now when the peace deal is being approached, are there any historical models that could inspire a workable plan, or is Ukraine's situation more unique?
Yeah, I think it is unique. I think it is unique because every time I'm here about some comparisons and analogies being made, they don't fly, they don't cut entirely. Like some people say, okay, it's West Germany, versus East Germany during the Cold War, when Germany was divided for like 40 years or so. Yeah, almost exactly 40 years. So, but then you had an alliance, a strong alliance led by US, with viable security guarantees, with American troops being based in Germany. There's some of them are still based there, and actually, Trump has been considering removing those troops, and we'll see what he does now. Because by the end of his first term in the White House, he actually authorized those troops to be removed. It was a very short notice, and then eventually he lost elections, and Biden came in power, and he reversed that decision. But we'll see what happens to American troops elsewhere in Europe, and some weapons also stored, American weapons stored in Germany. Of course, during the Cold War, there were also strategic nuclear weapons, in Germany and Great Britain and Italy. Right now, it's tactical nuclear weapons mostly, but at the same time, there was a different situation with West Germany, and it was invited to NATO. Okay, in 1955. Right now, no one is inviting Ukraine into NATO, despite Ukraine, really wanting to be part of this collective security arrangement and having some arguments how it would actually enhance NATO and make it stronger if Ukraine joins. All right, but everyone, of course, is terrified that if Ukraine joins, then they would have to fight against Russia. And moreover, now the Trump administration, of course, he's not going. They're not going to consider this option. So the Korean scenario, for instance, but then again, it was fought for a long time. Americans fought in the South, on a part of the South. American troops are there in big numbers. American weapons are there, so there are strong security guarantees. I mean, again, South Koreans now worry about what Trump might have for them. Would he defend them? In what way? Maybe he would throw troops there as well. But historically, they've been a very strong American presence there. So none of those scenarios that you look around, is good enough. And the Finlandization, for instance, also, when Finland during the Cold War had normal relations with Soviet Union, quite friendly even sometimes, but then continued to develop its economy and its democracy in the way that it is just a normal, civilized, democratic European country now. But Ukraine has never been allowed to do that. Putin doesn't want for Ukraine to be a prosperous European democracy. That's going to be a challenge to him. If Ukraine succeeds with democratic reforms, that's going to be always a challenge for him. That's why he was always really afraid of this color revolution, so-called, when Ukraine was making big steps towards becoming a more democratic country. He really is afraid of this being contagious and spreading to Russia. What if Russians come in streets demanding fair government like Ukrainians did? So therefore, that's also not an option for us. So unfortunately, none of those historic precedents that people are bringing to this conversation work. So therefore, I think this situation is unique in many ways. But we need to think about the formats, obviously, going forward, even when the war is over, there will be a lot of resentment against Russia in Ukraine. People are not going to quite forgive Russia for what they did to Ukraine, because a lot of people are actually asking Ukrainians even now, but can't you just forgive Russians and get along with them? Well, not really. It's hard. You can try. Like in some other domestic internal conflicts around the world, people are trying this national reconciliation policies. But first of all, it's within the country, like in Rwanda or South Africa or elsewhere. And second of all, well, the crimes that the Russians committed, they're really unforgivable and absolutely unprovoked. Ukraine did nothing to bring it up on ourselves. So therefore, the only position that can guarantee in the longer term our security and our protection and safety of Ukraine vis-a-vis Russia, is a position of strength. We have weapons, do we have troops, do we have peacekeepers, do we have this coalition of willing countries who continue to support Ukraine? Do we still have a strong army? Because Russia wants, of course, demilitarize Ukraine. We still haven't heard anything Trump saying about that, because Russians said like maybe 50,000 or 100,000 of Ukrainian troops at the maximum. That is nothing, of course, against the big Russian army, and considering how long is the territory, how big is the territory of Ukraine also. So no air defense, obviously. So if they like, they want to strike Ukraine, like you said, with your own hometown or my hometown of Odessa, easily, because Ukraine wouldn't be protected at all. So basically, the complete demilitarization and destroying any defenses for Ukraine. So that's not the way forward, and that's why we are so adamant in trying to come up and appealing to our friends around the world and other people of common sense. Like, okay, do we really want to have to reward this aggressor with giving him everything he wanted? That is, Ukraine being defenseless, vulnerable, and completely at his mercy, undermining any concept of sovereignty in contemporary world, despite the will of the big European nation. Ukraine is the largest European country. If you don't count Russia, so after Russia, if you count Russia, largest European nation, strategically located. If Ukraine, kind of crumbles down, that's going to be a problem for the entire bigger region, including European, Euro-Atlantic security. Is going to be a message emboldening aggressors and dictators around the world. That's not just a hollow sound. That's really what's going to happen. People will see, okay, Putin did it, and he got away with it. He's been rewarded by major European countries and by US. So what's preventing us from doing something like that to other countries? And of course, we're going to be living then from there on in the jungle. No international norms, no rule of law, nothing, no international order, just big predators, roaming around and picking up at their willing on the weaker, prey, weaker animals, and destroying them. So I don't think anyone in Europe or elsewhere would want this kind of world, and that's why it's very important. At this point of time, we're not talking about defeating Russia, but at least standing up for Ukraine as a decisive point, and providing Ukraine with enough assistance so that Ukraine continues to exist.
Yes, about the point that they ask Ukrainians to try to forgive or forget. Just recently, we had demonstration in Vienna, and the man who lost his wife, his children came to speak.
Yeah.
And it's difficult to comprehend, like, because of Russian aggression.
Yeah. Was that Basilevich or?
Yes.
Yeah. All right. Yeah, that's especially a horrible situation when a person in 1 minute in a city which is well removed from the front line in Lviv loses his wife and his 3 beautiful, talented daughters. That's just unthinkable. How can you live further on? And I'm really grateful to him that he finds strength to actually go and talk to people in Europe and explain to them what we're dealing with, because some people don't really understand what we're dealing with as Ukrainians. Unfortunately, after 3 years of war, other news making the first pages of European newspapers or the world newspapers, and Ukraine is kind of disappearing from the radar, and that's awful. That's terrible, because we're still dealing with the biggest war since Second World War. I mean, I understand that people have been dying here and there, and like in Syria, for instance, since 2011, or in the Gaza sector or something, but and around the world, there's been the Rwanda genocide I mentioned today. But in terms of a clear-cut aggression of one major European or world power against another, 2 biggest European countries fighting and one of them attacking another, that's absolutely unprecedented. And that's why it's in everyone's interest to stop it, but stop it in a way that it doesn't repeat itself, in a way that would prop up and support Ukraine's security and therefore European and Euro-Atlantic security.
Thank you so much. And when you look at the whole arc of Ukraine's history from independence to war, what does this war mean? Not just for Ukraine, but for how the world understands national sovereignty, democracy, and power.
Well, it means a lot to us. I mean, in some ways, it's our war of independence because we didn't have one once Ukraine was created or Ukraine established itself as an independent nation in 1991. Because at that point of time, Soviet system crumbled, Soviet Union disintegrated, and that's how we got these new countries, like which were called for a while newly independent countries of the Soviet Union, including Ukraine. But before that, generations of Ukrainians fought and gave their lives for Ukraine's freedom. Mostly unsuccessful because, as we know, of course, Ukraine didn't have any big stretches, big streaks, big periods of independence before. So since '91, of course, we managed to become a stronger country economically. And since 2014, when Russia launched its aggression against Ukraine, the Ukrainian military got much stronger, which became a bitter surprise, I suppose, to Moscow in 22 that the Ukrainian troops have been able to fight back quite successfully. And but we always saw Russia as a threat. People have been divided in Ukraine on that. Some people saw maybe Russia is a big brother indeed, as a friendly country, ethnically kin, both Eastern Slavs and everything, and also religiously close because the Eastern Orthodox Christianity being a religion of most people, for most people in both Russia and Ukraine. And but then 2014 happened, Crimea and Donbass. A lot of people already saw, okay, Russia is an aggressor. And then, of course, since 22, Ukraine clearly sees reasons to believe that Russia is an aggressor, not a big brother, because what kind of big brother just wants to strangle to death the little brother? That just doesn't make sense. And even people in the east and the south, where you have a lot of like ethnic Russians and Russian speakers, some of them were kind of pro-Russian before, but now they've been devastated the most by a Russian attack. That's exactly where aggression happened. Where you have cities and towns flattened out completely and just destroyed, not existing anymore. Reasonably large towns and cities. So therefore, that changing really, of course, the attitude towards Russia. People see it as a mortal threat. We're in one boat, regardless of which language we use in our daily conversations. A lot of Russian speakers are defending Ukraine, of course, in the trenches against Russia. So that kind of argument that Russia is somehow defending Russians or Russian speakers in Ukraine doesn't hold any water. Because there are so many Russian speakers and ethnic Russians in Ukraine who say we don't want them to do it. We want them get out of our land instead, and we're ready to fight for Ukraine, against this imperialistic, aggressive Russia. And they are imperialistic empire here. They want to grab land. They're not shy away with this. They just want to have more land. And some people say, but look at the map. Isn't Russia already big enough? All right, isn't that true that Russia actually neglects so many regions within Russia? Not really paying much attention to what's happening beyond Urals mountains, for instance, to the extent that people in the Far East, for instance, in Russia, often questioning are we of any interest to Moscow or not? That they need more land, that they need to take away land from Ukraine and mineral resources, because what they're getting in Donbass, for instance, that's a lot of natural resources that Ukraine have. So also part of imperialistic grab. Yes, this is a pure imperialistic war, that we haven't seen in such a blatant terms that Russia is waging, and therefore, not only Ukrainians should see it, but the rest of the world should see it and should therefore be on the side of Ukrainians. If not only for the sake of Ukrainians, I'm not even arguing that people should just feel sorry for Ukrainians or be altruistic and be outraged and say, okay, we need to support Ukraine, but for the benefit for the entire international order, international system, respect for law, respect for human rights, respect for the right of children to be with their parents and not taken away from their parents and kidnapped to the neighboring country. For all this, and the list goes on. For all of this matters. The good people of the world stood up for Ukraine in the recent 3 years, and they should continue to do that now. Despite all this talk in the air that the peace is close, it still matters to us even more than before that the people who supported Ukraine before should continue to do that, because otherwise we wouldn't be able maybe to reach a fair and viable peace without their support.
Yes, thank you. In my last question, I would like to come back a bit to the beginning and ask you about the international relations. If
Yes.
you had a magical wand and could change one thing the international relations is being done now, what would you change?
Well, there are many things that need to be changed. I mean, first of all, you need to think about Ukraine being better protected, ideally as a NATO member, and also beef up NATO in many ways. Eliminate all doubts that people might have that the Chapter 5 on collective defense of the founding Washington Treaty of NATO will be respected. So the people in Baltics, in Poland, in Finland, in Sweden, Romania, and elsewhere, and Ukraine, if it becomes part of NATO, I would be absolutely sure that other countries of NATO would come to their defense if needed. Second thing, you need to continue to try to reform United Nations, because that's a problem. That the largest world body responsible for international peace is basically paralyzed, not working. Because there's one country there, is a permanent member of Security Council, it's a veto power. It's Russia, of course, which blocks any sensible resolutions. And then, of course, China is often siding with Russia, unfortunately. And then, of course, now US is basically voting the same line with Russia to the extent that Russia uploads to what US diplomacy does these days. So, that need to be changed. People need to understand that, unfortunately, the conflict, the war of a type that Russia is waging against Ukraine now is possible. It was considered maybe not feasible, not possible, it's not going to happen before 22. The big war against between two major countries, powers, but it's happening. So therefore, need to think about their own security and how they're going to protect themselves. And unfortunately, that means that they need to invest more into defense. I mean, the time after the end of the Cold War, when Europeans, for instance, enjoyed this peace dividend, of the end of Cold War, and they thought this major war, this major threat, is not going to happen anytime ever again. Like during the Cold War, there will be no Soviet threat because there is no Soviet Union anymore. But now, wake up, because it's going to be a problem, and that's why it's really a good idea to actually invest more in your defenses. I understand that means that maybe less money would be given for other important areas of life that people want to enjoy and want to have in their countries, including education, healthcare, infrastructure, what have you, fighting the climate change and everything. But what's the point of having good educational system if you are not protected against future aggression? That would all go crumble in one day. Because in Ukraine, we're also striving to have a normal life. We all had our normal lives, maybe imperfect. Ukrainian democracy, maybe it wasn't perfect in some ways, but it was a democracy. And people enjoyed their peaceful lives, and Ukraine was actually developing and having some economic growth until the moment they came and started destroying everything around. So that's a lesson, I think, that Europeans and other people around the world should actually take into account. It's very fragile. This peaceful life where you invest so much into peaceful areas of your life at the expense of underinvesting in defense and security, that's very fragile. It's not going to hold. There are threats out there. I'm not necessarily saying that Russia, like that I know for sure, like in a year or 5 years or 10 years from now, Russia is going to attack Finland or Sweden or Poland or something. I don't have a crystal ball. But at the same time, it's quite probable. But definitely, if Ukraine is allowed to go under, that's going to be a major, major problem for a lot of people in a lot of countries around the world. It's not just the Ukrainian problem. So for that sake, for that matter, the appeal from Ukrainians is like, please stand with us. Not just because you kind of like Russians or kind of hate, like Ukrainians or hate Russians, but for the sake of your own countries.
I think we as Ukrainians definitely learned how to appreciate right now. And
absolutely.
thank you so much.
Thank you for your invitation, Tetiana. It was my pleasure to speak to you today.
It was also my pleasure to get to know you, and thank you for your insightful answers. Maybe there's something you would like to add?
No, I think we covered a lot of ground, and I just appreciate you reaching out. And we Ukrainians, we cherish, value every opportunity to speak about this war, about our situation, and to continue to bring attention of the people around the world to this terrible war, which is still ongoing, which is still waging. So that's a problem, and that's why I think conversations like we had today are really needful.
Yes, I think so as well. It was very important for me that the first episode will be exactly about Russian aggression of Ukraine.
Great.
Also Ukrainian myself.
Thank you. thank you to you personally and for everyone else who was involved in organizing this conversation.
Thank you so much as well.